Hey everybody, thanks for joining us for Making the Grade. We have moved Making the Grade with Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News to a morning edition.
Yes.
I decided we need to get mugs that said Making the Grade
That would
morning.
that's the next thing.
I know,
we need
we have to have swag.
Exactly.
So in case you haven't seen Making the Grade, we typically bring this to you in the afternoons on Wednesday, but we thought moving to the mornings might be a better way to communicate with all of you and make sure that people are seeing what we're talking about. So I appreciate you joining me for
no
coffee.
problem. Yes.
Coffee chat.
Yes.
Coffee chat. So Kevin has actually been up working since 6 a.m. this morning?
Yeah, it was
writing,
early because there's a lot of breaking news that came Tuesday night into Wednesday morning.
including a press release at midnight from Reclaim Idaho. So for people who don't know or don't remember who Reclaim Idaho is, tell us who they are, Kevin, and what they're proposing.
Okay, so Reclaim Idaho, that was the group that was the driving force behind the Medicaid initiative, the Medicaid expansion initiative that passed last November with 61% support. This was the group that got that initiative on the ballot. Well, what they're doing now is they're focusing their attention on K-12 and education spending. And the meat of this initiative, and they have submitted the paperwork to the Secretary of State's office, that's the first step in this process. The meat of the idea is to increase income tax rates for corporations and creating a new personal income tax bracket for people making more than $250,000 a year, for the wealthiest Idahoans. Take that increase in income taxes, which they peg at somewhere north of $170 million a year, and put that into a fund for K-12 programs. And the way the language from the initiative reads, that money in that fund could go into any number of things. You could use it to boost teacher pay, you could put it into all-day kindergarten, you could use it for classroom supplies and textbooks, you could hire teachers to reduce class sizes or keep class sizes from increasing. So that money would go into a dedicated fund for education for any number of purposes.
Who would handle the fund? Who would, the legislature would decide how to spend the money, or?
I'm not really sure how the mechanics of the fund would work, except that, it reads like a standalone fund specifically for K-12 and specifically for K-12 initiatives.
So as you and I were talking before coming on today, a lot of people would say, oh, that's fine, whatever, nice idea, nice initiative. But there is some backing to this when you've got Reclaim Idaho behind it. And as you said, Medicaid expansion happened because of their grassroots efforts.
This was a group that mobilized around the state and managed to get the Medicaid initiative on the ballot. And getting an initiative on the ballot, even under the current rules, let alone what was discussed at the legislature this year, even under the current rules, it's difficult.
It's tough
to get an initiative on the ballot. It takes work, it takes mobilization, it takes volunteers, or it takes paid signature gatherers. Any way you try to do it, it takes work. Reclaim Idaho got the Medicaid expansion initiative on the ballot. And then they put together a pretty strong coalition of supporters around the initiative itself. And as I mentioned before, it passed easily with a 61% majority. Now we're going through this whole process of how is the legislature going to implement the Medicaid expansion. And as we see, sometimes the implementation of an initiative is a whole different animal than actually getting an initiative on the ballot and getting one passed. But to your point, this is a group that's had success, and fairly recent success, with the initiative process. So by virtue of that, you kind of have to take this proposal seriously just because of Reclaim Idaho's recent track record.
So what are the next steps? You said the first step here is to go to the Secretary of State and actually file for the initiative. What happens now?
Well, what happens then in the next few months would be the signature gathering process. And assuming, assuming is maybe too strong a word, but if this initiative gets on the ballot, then it would be on the ballot in November of 2020. So it would be there alongside of the presidential election, right. A U.S. Senate election, all of these legislative races. So voters would have a chance to decide whether they want to sign on with the initiative.
It's fascinating to me that, do you think that Reclaim Idaho is taking the momentum that they've built and trying to latch onto this, and why choose K-12 education as the focus? Was there any bigger idea behind why they thought not enough money going into K-12 education? I mean, the Reclaim Idaho kind of logo even works with that idea, I guess.
Right. I think clearly as an organization, they're trying to capitalize on their success and the momentum of the Medicaid expansion. And it feels to some degree like this campaign is going to maybe touch on some of the same sort of themes that we saw with Medicaid expansion. A big part of what came out in just the initial news release explaining this initiative, the Reclaim Idaho folks pointed to the supplemental tax levy, that the supplemental tax, the supplemental levy bill that continues to rise across the state, the $200 million of supplemental levies that voters approve and pay for out of property taxes. A key theme from Reclaim Idaho is let's take some of that burden off of property owners. Let's take some of the pressure off of local patrons who have to approve these levies every 1 or 2 years. Let's see if we can fund some of these education initiatives through another path. Another point that they made in their news release was that the legislature reduced these income tax rates in 2018. They did that on the heels of the federal tax overhaul. The point that Reclaim Idaho is making, and this is one that I'm sure will be vetted out and will be much debated in the months to come, their claim is that most of that money in corporate tax reductions went to out-of-state corporations. So it really didn't benefit in-state corporations. So they couch it as a corporate tax giveaway at the same time that local property owners are paying the bill in the form of supplemental levies. So you can see where the battle lines are going to be drawn on this fairly clearly.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see who jumps on which part of this too.
And there may be more, I go back to the Medicaid expansion. Once it got on the ballot and once it became a campaign question heading into the November elections, you had quite a few organizations siding with Medicaid expansion, including some education groups who said that
they needed this.
That this was needed to, for child welfare, for the health and welfare of students coming into classrooms. Really, the opposition to Medicaid expansion was centered on the Idaho Freedom Foundation. They, kind of became de facto the prime opponents of Medicaid expansion. I suspect if you're talking about an increase in corporate taxes and the creation of a high income, individual income tax bracket, I think you may see more resistance from tax groups, from lobbying groups, from corporate lobbyists. I think this may be a more complicated campaign in that sense.
And fascinating to see, though, too, what corporations may actually come on board, if so, because the other side of this coin has always dropped, which is that, businesses have said we need to make sure that our K through 12 education system here in Idaho is one of the best so that they can actually recruit and keep people here in the workforce. So I think you're going to have both sides of this really coming at each other. And it'll be fascinating to see, too, if this makes it on the ballot, where the governor stands.
Where the governor stands, and you could easily see that this is kind of a conundrum for a group like Idaho Business for Education, which represents CEOs from across the state and has taken on education topics. So where that group comes down and what sort of input they get from their membership as to where they're going to come down, that could be very fascinating to watch if we get to that stage.
Right.
We were just at that first stage today.
It's interesting.
It is.
It gives much to talk about.
There's a lot there, so we'll be watching this closely.
Let's continue to roll on some money because State Superintendent Sherry Ibarra released her budget, which is due usually the very beginning of September, right?
Right. It was due on Friday, and it was turned in on Friday.
So this comes out way before, obviously, the governor releases his own budget. So it's maybe a precursor a little bit to what might be coming for education spending. And she's looking to increase the K through 12 education budget for the next year.
And she's going to pick up on a theme that we've talked about in the past few weeks and we've seen emerge in the past few weeks, and that's the question of what to do in terms of teacher salaries, especially veteran teacher salaries. So the quick look at the numbers on Superintendent Ibarra's budget proposal is she wants about a 5.3% increase in education spending. That would get the K-12 budget very close to the $2 billion mark. And that comes to about just slightly more than $100 million in new money for education for K-12. the big chunk of that money, about $40 million, would go into a new installment of teacher pay raises, this time focused on veteran teachers.
So we've talked about this a lot, obviously, because Governor Little's task force is dealing with this exact issue right now. And we can go back, and if you don't know the history here, when the initial task force under Governor Otter looked at giving these career ladder, where they kind of set up installments of what teachers were going to make from the state level, there was an initial thought that the top out should be $60,000 for teachers. It never got there.
Never got there.
There
never was approved.
$50,000 right now. So that's really what this little task force is looking at doing for veteran teachers, trying to keep them in the classroom. And now you've got the superintendent trying to make her budget work with that as well.
And the superintendent, who is a member of Little's education task force, maybe not surprising that she's picking up the mantle of the issue of trying to get more money for veteran teacher salaries. And this is something, you know, as you mentioned, I think there's some momentum behind the idea of doing something to keep veteran teachers in the classroom. And I think there's some frustration that maybe what's been done so far in this regard isn't really working. So maybe not surprising, well, maybe not surprising. I don't think it's surprising at all to me that Superintendent Ibarra is picking up on the idea of increasing pay for veteran teachers. I think there's a lot of political momentum behind that idea. Now the question is, where do you come up with the money? Because $40 million in this budget year, it could be tough. It could be hard to come up with. The legislature has been putting that kind of money into teacher pay raises the past few years. This may just be a tighter budget year for a lot of reasons that we've already been talking about.
Well, one of the interesting things, because you said that she's basically asking for $100 million extra. Much of that is the teacher career increase, pay ladder increase. The one piece that kind of stuck out to me, and it didn't have that big a money allocation attached to it, I think about $1 million, was this social emotional training. Where's that coming from? Kevin?
Well, I think it's coming from the idea of trying to head off some of the mental health issues and some of the issues that students have in the classroom. This is not a budget that really talks much about a school safety initiative. If you remember, that was something that Superintendent Ibarra pushed for last year with about a $19 million program that didn't go anywhere with the legislature. So she's not talking about school safety in this budget proposal, but she is seeing this as a school safety issue, that training teachers and training staff in helping students who are having problems, that is maybe a preventative step to head off some problems with students, and make schools safer by helping students work through problems that they're dealing with.
Well, it kind of ties into her bullying campaign as well,
yes,
that she's been trying to do. So when you get all these line items, because there are some things in there, there's something for literacy, there's talk of making sure that money is going into the scholarships that students can get going into schools. You start to put a budget together like this, Kevin, and there's so many pieces to it. What happens? I mean, is the legislature going to take this? She has to go in front of JFAC when they get back into town and present this budget. There's so many little pieces to it. Do they nix some of them? Do they add some of them? Do they look at what Governor Little proposes? What happens here?
Well, a lot's going to happen between now and January. First of all, even Ibarra said that the budget that she presented and submitted on Friday, it may not be the final word. Because from her,
yeah.
Because the task force is still working and will be working into the fall. Their recommendations aren't due until October, November. So she said that she may come back with a revised budget proposal to reflect some of the recommendations that are coming from that task force. So what we see here in September may not be what we see in November, and it may not be what Superintendent Ibarra presents at the legislature in January. But also, in early January, you're going to see what Governor Little wants to do with the budget, and especially the education budget, which we'll watch very closely. I wonder how this is all going to play itself out. One thing that Ibarra said in her news release explaining her budget proposal was that a $100 million increase in education is not unprecedented at all.
Which is true over the last few years. That's
for 5 straight years, the legislature has increased the K-12 budget by at least $100 million a year. That's true, and that's a reflection on the response to Governor Otter's task force and the recommendations from Governor Otter's task force. And Ibarra can say, look, the budget has increased by $100 million a year every year that I've been in office. And that's true, that's correct, that's accurate. I just wonder if there's going to be the kind of money available to float a $100 million increase for K-12 when there are a lot of uncertainties about this budget. There are a lot of uncertainties about revenue flow. There are uncertainties about what the cost of Medicaid expansion may turn out to be. You've got legislators who are still grumbling about the potential cost of Medicaid expansion. And you have some fairly large proposals coming from this K-12 task force already that potentially could cost tens of millions of dollars. The teacher pay increases will cost tens of millions of dollars no matter how you slice it up, to do something kind of what on the order of what the state has done with the career ladder. You're talking about tens of millions of dollars.
And lawmakers get skittish.
And
too.
Lawmakers, I think right now, quite a few lawmakers are skittish because the revenue numbers are coming in low, because there are other pressures on this budget, and because in an election year, you probably still have legislators who are hoping to, if not, get a tax cut through, there's certainly not going to be much appetite to increase taxes. So I just wonder, and this has really nothing to do with the merits of what Ibarra is proposing in terms of education initiatives. I just wonder how the money's going to hold up and what the money situation is going to look like when legislators hit town in January and beyond. Right now, it's a very cloudy picture.
We'll wait and see what the K-12 task force does as well, because that's going to set up Governor Little for deciding what he wants to put in his budget. So stay tuned there too, because changes could be coming. Something on that same line, in case you haven't heard, there's a chunk of money that's set aside for master educator premiums. Basically, Kevin, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is a way for teachers, veteran teachers specifically, to try and increase their salary by about $4,000 through an application process. But there's been first of all, it's complicated. The application process in and of itself, some teachers complaining about it. And secondly, it's now delayed. Right.
So again, this goes back to what to do about veteran teachers and how to compensate veteran teachers. So the Master Educator Premium, this is the first year of this program. It is designed to be a $4,000 a year pay boost, bonus, however you want to word it.
One time?
No, it's for up to 3 years. Okay. So it's $4,000 a year for 3 years. And it's supposed to reward veteran teachers who are high performers in the classroom. And that's where this whole application process comes in. Teachers have to demonstrate what they're doing, complete a very lengthy portfolio and submit that for review. Some educators have said that application process, that portfolio process, took upwards of 120 hours to complete.
It's long.
So as a result, you probably didn't have as many teachers apply for this as the state might have expected. There are about 1,400 teachers who did apply. And I feel like we hear from quite a few of them as this process is unfolding because they want an answer. They want to know if they're going to receive a share of the money. And they're not going to find out, at least for the next couple of weeks. The State Board of Education had hoped to make the awards by September 1st. That didn't happen. There are some delays in reviewing these applications. So they're saying now, the State Board, that the award may come down by mid-September. So it's a couple of weeks of delay.
It'll be fascinating to see how many applications came in and how many are awarded from those applications. Because it is a review process where teachers actually are reviewing teachers, correct?
Yes, they're teachers who have been paid a stipend to review other applications. And there are teachers, and I've heard from some, who applied for a premium on their own and also applied to be a reviewer of other applications. So, and that's been a process that's been going on for the past few weeks. And one of the hangups right now in terms of getting the premiums awarded is that some of these applications are going now to a third reviewer. The way it's happened with some of these applications is one reviewer has said yes and another one has said no. So now you have kind of a deciding vote. You have to come up with a reviewer to break the tie and review these applications. So that process is continuing, and like I say, mid-September is now the target date to award the premiums. But, you know, go back to a lot of what we've already been talking about this morning. I think there are a lot of questions right now about how effective this premium program is going to be, and whether that's really the recipe, whether that's the way to reward and provide incentives for veteran teachers to stay in the classroom. And, you know, and this is a $7 million line item right now, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in Governor Little's budget recommendation, how it comes, you know, what the task force has to say before that, and what the legislature winds up saying. Because, you know, right now it's a $7 million program that doesn't seem to be making very many people all that happy. A lot of teachers feel, you know, that this was burdensome, that this was time consuming. Some feel downright insulted that they have to go through this kind of a process to prove their worth, to justify an increase in pay. You know, and I think you have, you know, some legislators who are concerned that it isn't working very well. You have Bill Gilbert, who's one of the co-chairs of Governor Little's task force, saying, look, I'm a businessman. I wouldn't do this in one of my places of employment. It just doesn't make sense. So a lot of dominoes could fall here in the education budget in general. And this is a program to watch in the months ahead. I'll be really curious to see what happens, if it gets tweaked, if it gets
swallowed
refined,
up.
if it gets, if the money gets morphed into some other program to reward veteran teachers. A lot can happen in the next few months.
You know, we would love it if you have applied for one of these master premiums. We'd love to hear your comments too, and hear what you had to go through, how long the process took you, why you decided to do it this way. If you think it's a good way, I would love to get feedback on this so that we could hear from you as well. Okay, before you go, Kevin, let's just quickly hit on direct admissions, because seniors across the state of Idaho will be receiving postcards first and then letters telling them that they've been accepted to school if they've met certain requirements into an Idaho school. Of course, those seniors still have to apply to go to the state-run schools. But this is kind of a big deal, because this seems to be something on the surface that is a program that's been rolled out over the last few years and is working in some ways.
Right, so we're 4 years into this, and the bottom line, if you're a high school senior or if you're the parent of a high school senior and you get something in the mail from the State Board of Education, don't throw it away.
No.
It's important.
It's an admission letter.
Right, and what it will do is it will tell it'll tell you if you're qualified, you know, which schools you're qualified for, which schools you're basically pre-approved and ensured admission into. The State Board has been doing this now for several years. It started in 2015, and the idea is that by letting seniors know, hey, you're already in college, you're already admitted to all 8 2- and 4-year colleges in the state, or most of the 2- and 4-year colleges in the state. It really kind of depends on grades and test scores. But if you tell students, hey, you're already in, all you need to do is apply, and you can apply for free, the hope is that more students will apply and will ultimately wind up going to college. So the postcards go out this week, the letters go out in October, which is about the time that students can start to apply for college.
The statistic that I thought was great that's on Idaho Education News' website, and the story you guys wrote, is that last year, 47% of the senior class in the state of Idaho went on and applied for school.
Right.
I mean, so you've got half the senior class taking advantage of this. What happens in that process, and actually if they do go on to school or not, is not necessarily known, but at least you've got an idea that half the senior class is basically doing this.
And I think what it comes down to is I think the State Board has tried to remove as many roadblocks as possible to make it as easy as possible and as convenient as possible for high school seniors to apply to college. You've taken the cost consideration off the table because students can apply for free. You've taken some of the redundancy of the application process and you've kind of eliminated that, because as my understanding of it is that when you go onto the Next Steps Idaho website, you can apply to multiple schools at once. And that's what the State Board is seeing, that it's not just that 47% of students went and applied. But on average, those students applied to 3 colleges because, again, it's free, it's easy, you can apply to
the
multiple
boxes.
schools, and you can, weigh your options later in the school year, which college feels like the right fit. So it's all part of this process to try to, encourage high school seniors to consider staying in school and staying in Idaho to get their education.
We'll see what happens this year
Yep.
if those numbers continue to increase. All of these stories and much, much more, because the people over at Idaho Education News don't sleep. They just write and have
Well,
their
we sleep. We
computers
just
by
get up
their
really
beds.
early and start writing some days.
I don't know. You were up feeding the dog in like the middle of the night and
That's
checking
a
your
dog
emails.
issue. That's just, that has nothing to do
That's
with.
not a journalistic
no,
issue.
that's
a dog
just
issue.
a delinquent dog issue.
Well, anyway, if you would like to read about all the good work they're doing in education news reporting, go to idahoednews.org. O-R-G. Kevin, I appreciate our morning making the grade.
Yeah, that's great.
I know. We'll be taking your comments as we go along too. So we'll join you every Wednesday morning starting around 10 a.m. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.